everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today, I'm honoured and delighted to be speaking with sports psychologist Dr Chesli Day. Chelsea, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
It's really cool to have you on. I'm really excited to be talking about various topics. I think to get us started, it would be really cool if you could introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show.
Sure. I am a sports psychologist based out of Ohio in the U.S. I currently work for the Ohio State University as a sports psychologist within the athletic department. I've been here for about almost 6 months. Was at Indiana University in, surprise, Indiana, and was there for 3 years as the director of counseling and sports psychology. And so my primary role in both of these jobs has been to provide mental health services as well as performance enhancement services to our student athletes at the university, as well as consult with our coaches, consult with administration, do team-based talks, in addition to the individual consultation that I do.
Now, being English, I can assure you we are always in awe of the college programs in the States, how
Sure.
vast they are, how wide they are, because we just don't have, we're proud of our university sport, but we just don't have the same setup. A population thing, and a historical and a cultural thing. And I just think it would be really interesting for the audience to get more of a grasp of what a sports psychologist within a college athletic setup does, how you spend time. Do you work with all teams? Do you work with other sports sites? A bit of a wide-ranging question, so I do apologise. How does it work? What's your day-to-day role?
Sure, yeah. So, it looks different everywhere. So when I was at Indiana, we had about 650 student athletes across 24 teams. I was the only person for my 3 years there. I was lucky to be able to hire a second person about 6 weeks before I left. So they have two now, but so I was a little bit more siloed. I was working a lot with physicians and athletic trainers, but I was a one-man show, kind of all things to all people. It's a little bit different here at Ohio State, and that was some of the draw. I loved my job at Indiana. There was so much great stuff about it. Lifestyle, changes were part of the draw as well, being able to live close to work and all that. But the opportunity here at Ohio State, we have 36 teams. We have about 1,200 student athletes, and we have 4 in our sports psych department. So 2 of us are doctoral level sports psychologists who are clinically trained in addition to the performance work. And then we have 2 athletic counselors. So we do the same exact job, but the way that psychologists protected over here, they can't be psychologists because they're at the master level for their licensure. So they are both clinical social workers by training with their specialization in sport and exercise psychology. So there's 4 of us doing the same thing, but divided in 2 different titles because of, legalese. So my day-to-day, what's so cool about the job is every day looks a little bit different. So if I just kind of take this week as a really great snapshot, I guess I was out Monday, but Mondays I'm typically meeting one-on-one with student athletes all day. On Tuesdays, I primarily meet with student athletes, but I also go to something that we call advanced performance teams, APT meetings. And these are our meetings where, it is our strength coach, our coaching staff, our athletic trainer, sport nutrition, myself, and if that team has a director of ops of some sort, we all get in a room together and we go through, everyone gives updates. What do we need to know? Are there student athletes of concern from a performance, injury, or mental health perspective? Because of confidentiality, I'm more of a listener than a sharer, but I'm able to help consult as things come up. So I go to one of those always on Tuesdays. And Wednesdays are I'm on call, so each of us is on call on a particular day so that during daytime hours, an athletic trainer or an academic advisor could, if my cell phone rings, I answer it. Regardless of whether I'm in a meeting with someone, a one-on-one meeting, whether I'm giving a talk, Wednesdays are my day. And so that's also the day that I do more meetings than individual consultations so that I'm a little more interruptible. If an emergency comes up, I can step away. So I do another APT meeting on Wednesdays. I sometimes will go to a staff meeting, or I try to schedule team talks. So with our field hockey team in a couple weeks on a Wednesday, I have an inclusion talk coming up. Thursdays vary as well. Sometimes I have some different meetings and presentations. And we have our sports psych staff meeting where we're talking about what issues have come up. And then Fridays also for me are primarily student athlete days. So it's a good mix. I would say once or twice a week I'm giving a talk to a team. Sometimes I'm sitting down with a coach to troubleshoot something. We hospitalize at least 2 to 3 student athletes every semester for suicidal concerns. So there's crisis management involved in that. We're referring people to higher level of care. Some we have, even kind of one-off issues. There's a big substance abuse issue with someone. We've got to figure that out. Or we, here in the U.S., we drug test, particularly at the D1 level, we're drug testing regularly. And so when there's a positive drug test, we're involved in that, of making sure we're educating kids and screening to see if they need any additional resources beyond what we're providing. So it's really a lot of different stuff. Yesterday I gave a talk I do monthly talks for our coaches on a variety of topics. So it's 9 a.m. usually on Monday mornings, but this month it was a Wednesday. We talked about mental health basics. Here's some stats. Here's some things you need to be looking for. Here's some things that you can do to help. So that to help them know what they should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing, what they need to defer to us. So it really is a little bit of all things to all people. And that's what makes it so fun. I mean, it's easy to get out of bed in the morning knowing there's going to be something a little bit different every day. It's very unpredictable, which works well for my personality. So it was a big question. There's a big answer.
What I've written down, I've written down a few things. It sounds like a really integrated approach there. I mean, that process on a Tuesday with all the key stakeholders in the room, having a conversation. It sounds like an integrated approach rather than an isolated approach. The other thing I wrote down is this full coverage from the performance psychology area through to the welfare and well-being down to the mental health piece, if you like. Yep. So integration and full coverage.
Yeah, and that's really the goal, and Ohio State is a big school with plenty of money. And so we're able to do that, and we have our conferences here, and there's the Power 5, which are the 5 biggest conferences with the 5 biggest powerhouse all the programs. Yep. And so we're lucky enough to be able to do that. We're trending more and more that way. If folks have full-time sports psychology, they're integrating them a lot more. Not everywhere is lucky to have that, but we're heading in that direction. So it really, that's the goal. Now, some of our services are still kind of new here at Ohio State, so it was just as of August 1st of this year that we had 4 full-time people. It was a smaller situation before, so the integration is really taking off. We still have some teams that were not always invited to their APT meetings because we aren't kind of ingrained enough. I don't think it's intentional. I think it's not thinking about it yet. Whereas other teams are like, you come every week, right? And some teams only have them once a month. But the goal really is, how do we all, I always say it as, I want to be a part of the fabric of a student athlete experience. So I want to be seen just like anyone else. They go to their athletic trainer for stuff. It's no big deal. They go to their academic advisor for stuff. It's no big deal. That our role should be the same. Not everyone needs us all the time, and that's okay. But I want them to know that we're here. And I think too, that we try to educate the idea that, if you're struggling with mental health, but also, like you said, if you just are stressed, you need some stress management tips. You come in one time, get some stress management tips, you're good to go. I'm not performing the way I want to. Maybe we meet once or twice. I have kids who come in, we meet once for an hour. The next meeting is 15 or 20 minutes because the strategies are working for them right now, and they're good to go. If something pops up, they'll come back at some point. But the availability of us allows us to be really flexible in that way. And so that, I think that integration is the goal of what we're all trying to do at the college level. And the multiple domains of what we can offer is also part of the goal, because it also is a good foot in the door. There's still a lot of stigma around the mental health piece. If I can get them in the door for performance or just wellness, sleep issues, whatever, if there's mental health stuff going on, that's my in, and now we can address that stuff. So, that is the ideal of what we're trying to go for.
Well, I definitely want to touch on the mental health area. But just one question, and I think you touched upon it. You mentioned having 36 teams there. That's a lot of teams. That's going to be a lot of sports. And you mentioned that there may not be, and I appreciate you might not be able to discuss this in any depth due to confidentiality, but there may not be every single team that actually participates with the sports psychology department. If I may ask, are attitudes progressing there, if progression is the right way to put it? Are there specific sports that can be a little bit behind other sports? Or how does that landscape kind of work?
Yeah, I think that, so I gave this coaching talk yesterday on mental health basics, and I had really low expectations. I also was recording it webinar style so I could email it out, which to me was giving people an out if they don't want to come, but if they're still interested in the content. But I had like 35 coaches show up, and I was really pleasantly surprised, which tells me that we are progressing. And I've had 4 or 5 coaches email me since, and this was just yesterday, saying, hey, I listened to the recorded version. I listened to the audio file. So I think we're definitely getting there. I think that what you see is that the sport breakdown of who uses us is aligned with our greater cultural dynamics. So historically, our more macho type of sports, the more masculine sport culture that is expected in that sport, the lower the utilization. So, and not always, and I'll use wrestling as an example. So our wrestling coaches are really great. Every time I see them, we have great conversations. Whenever I'm at a meeting, we have great conversations. But it is a very masculine, tough, gritty sport. And so even the athletes, wrestlers, both at IU and here are slightly lower utilizers, which is not surprising, and I don't think is necessarily indicative of anything bad. It just shows that we have some work to do in both the stigma and education on how we can be useful. We're really lucky to have a football coach here. Football is oftentimes a low utilizer in many places. American football, obviously.
Yep.
But we have a coach here who's very mental health forward. He speaks out about it. He's involved with our local children's hospital on mental health promotion. Him and his wife made a big donation to the child mental health facility pavilion that's going in town. So he's really good about it. He actually invited us over to have open office hours in the football facility. So we were able to have an office where we had drop-in hours because he wanted us to be around. And so that was really cool. What I find is regardless of the sport, particularly our macho, our more tough sports, it's more for them relationship building. We have some of our more traditional sports that are female teams that tend to be I always use like warm and fuzzy, a little more emotionally based. They hear sports psychology or they hear, about these services and they want to use them because they know what that means. With some of our other sports, it's really about relationship building. So when I was over at Indiana, the first year I had pretty low utilization from football. And by the time I was leaving, I would be up in the dining hall grabbing my lunch and I'd have football guys come and giving me a side hug, showing me the dog they just got. And so it started to break that down, that once we stopped becoming the mental health professional behind the door, or even the performance person behind the door, because that can be intimidating too, because then you have to, if you're in a macho sport, you have to admit that you're not performing where you want to be, and that's hard. And so with those sports, with our lower utilizers, once we start building relationships and they see us as people, they tend to start, then it becomes, I'm going to meet with Chelsi versus I'm going to meet with the sports psychologist. And I think we're really starting that here at Ohio State. It's just so new that we haven't quite gotten there. So I think that, again, it's a mirror of our greater society. And when you think about what sports you probably think are lower utilizers, you're probably right. And the ones that are higher utilizers, you're probably right. But the more time we spend in there, the more time we spend around them. And we try to be around. We try to pop by practices and just be around. The more we see that stereotype and expectation break down a bit.
it's interesting as you speak. I'm thinking that I just wonder sometimes if there's a misunderstanding from some of these sports. You've used the word toughness. I wonder if there's a misunderstanding from some sports around the human condition and what it is to be a human being, and this what possibly would appear to be a paradoxical notion for these coaches and perhaps performers as well, in as much as to become tough, if that's the word, or to become resilient or to become strong, actually admitting vulnerability can be a useful thing.
I mean, I think that it's the key. I don't think you can be truly tough without that. I think that toughness is a word we throw around, and what we historically think is rub some dirt in it. The toughest people I know are the people, I mean, think about it, right? So if you think of a bridge is supposed to be really tough and strong. We want to be able to drive over it or throw a train over it and have it not fall. But the only way for that bridge to remain tough is to always be looking for weak spots and where we need to strengthen it. You know, we usually think broken and repair it. Anytime you notice a weakness or whatever, we're trying to strengthen it. And so by identifying areas of vulnerability, we're able to strengthen it, which is exactly what makes us tougher. If you ignore the problem, if you ignore it and say, no, we made it out of concrete and cement, it's tough, one of us is going to fall into the river in our car and have a pretty bad time. And so, you know, I think that a lot of it is we just have a lot of these wrong ideas, this misinformation that what sport culture has traditionally been is a place that was not science-based. It was emotionally driven of what toughness is, and culturally driven and societally driven. You know, it's a bigger thing than just sport. But we try, you know, I think all of us around the world are trying to do that education of vulnerability is how you get tough. You got to identify it, because if you don't, you're going to crumble. And then you're going to wonder why you crumbled. And we're going to sit there across from you and be like, oh, yeah, no, we could have predicted that. So now let's pick it back up. It's so much easier to strengthen a bridge when you notice a weakness than wait for it to crumble and have to try to fix it. It's also way more expensive. And that's true in life, too. It's more time consuming and more expensive to fix a problem in crisis than addressing it before we get there.
I love your bridge analogy. I'm going to shamelessly steal it from you, if that's okay, and use it
that
from
is
time to time. Standing on the shoulder of giants as always. And I think as well, I mean, we talked about that vulnerability piece, but you also mentioned that from a performance perspective, athletes have to create, or they have created a narrative in the sports that we're talking about. That to see a sports psychologist from a performance perspective is to admit there's something wrong, but again, how do we improve if we're not? Let's reframe it. If we're not excited about utilizing everything we can to improve our performance, then how can we be the best that we can be?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, there's this fear of failure complex, right? And again, anyone who does this work, we can roll our eyes, like, failure is how you learn. Like, we all have tropes, right? We have tropes that we use about failure. We've all got them, and they're all great. But there's this concept that is bad, or that weakness leads to failure. But, you know, I tell my kids all the time, if you don't have things to improve on, why are you here? Like, why are you here being coached? Like, you should be somewhere doing this for a living. Like, if you don't need coaching because you've already got it all down, then you're wasting your time here, because the whole point is to keep improving. The whole point is to always be getting better, and always to be able to have room to get better. It means that there's something that's not better yet. The only way I get better is if there's space for it, right? I'm a big metaphor person. I can only add more to a cup if there's space to add to it, right? If the cup is full, what am I going to do? I can't put more in it. And so none of us have a full cup in any domain of life. And so it's this idea of shifting that there's always room for improvement. And once you stop thinking there is, or you're fearful of admitting that there is, then you're stuck. You might as well quit, because what's the point? What's the point if we're not going to be getting better? And so, you know, it's trying to use that language of the positive psychology, the building on strengths, the continuous improvement versus this deficit idea that getting better means I have something wrong with me. If I could figure out how to do that easily and quickly, I would work myself out of a job. But, I think that it's shifting that mentality, that perspective. And I don't think we'll ever get there. And I think some of that is I work with college-aged kids. So the 18 to 22-year-old brain isn't really built for that fully, right? Like we're lacking our frontal lobe at that point. We're not there yet. And so, it's as long as I'm working with this group, as long as I have new 18-year-olds coming in, I'm going to keep doing this work and having these conversations. I think many of us grow into that perspective and many don't. And that's whatever. But I do think it's also a part of maturing and growing and being open to those ideas.
Let's dwell on that 18 to 22 notion, because you're dealing with that age range every single day. You're becoming an expert in that age range, and it obviously a lot of people talk about generational shifts of attitude, and it's almost cliche to say for the generation prior to the next one are always going, oh well, this generation, they can't do this, they don't do this, they don't do that. The generation before me were moaning about my generation and so on and so forth. And tell me about this generation, because you're dealing with it every day. Has there been a shift? Are things different, do you think? Well, what's your thoughts on, is it Generation Z, Generation Z?
It is. Yeah, it's, I love them. I think they're a really cool group. Now, I'll give the disclaimer that, to some degree, these generations are manufactured. And if you're in the earlier part of a generation, yes, there's plenty of difference between the younger part of the generation. I admittedly am in the oldest year of millennials, which I hate admitting. And technically, if you look at the breakdowns, I'm also in Gen X, so I like to say I'm a Zennial because I don't want to admit that I'm a millennial, because millennials are the most publicly hated generation we've had, purely because of social media. They aren't any more hated than any generation before them, but we know it more because we talk about it and we hate on them. Oh, millennials this, and their avocado toast, and all this garbage that we spew, right? Which, to be clear, those of us that complain about the younger generations, it's our fault. My generation is considered the trophy generation, right? Participate. Who gave us the participation trophies? I didn't buy myself a participation trophy at 10 years old. The adults that ran the league gave them. And now they're complaining about the participation trophies. So, I think what's really important as we all grumble and as we start talking about Gen Z and some of their unique aspects is we created these monsters. It is our fault. And we're blaming them for the behaviors that we're seeing, but we grew them up in the system that they're in. So, that to me is something that I find incredibly comical. I mean, think to one of the big stereotypes of this age group. Oh, they're always on their phone. When I talk about that part of it, almost every single person sitting in the room with me has their phone out in front of them and has checked it at least once while I've been talking. So we sit here and we're like, oh, they're always on their phone. So are we. I don't leave home without my phone, right? But we don't see ourselves do it. And when we're doing it, we're not noticing it because it's not taking our time away. When they're on it, it's because they're doing it when we don't want them to. So, the context, the asterisk is obviously there are differences. Obviously, there are similarities between them. But I do think it's important to think about it. So, how generations are defined, how that all works is that a generation is considered a cohort of people who've had similar experiences. So particularly for those, worldwide, but specifically for those of us in the U.S., the folks that experienced the Great Depression, that was really impactful. That was a shared experience. My cohort is a group that remembers where we were in 9/11, right? Like we remember that. Yep. And that's a salient part. There is a very clear pre that time and post that time. Even if we get down to the nitty gritty, kids that get on airplanes right now don't have any concept of what it was like to fly here before that, where it was a lot easier and simpler and you had to take off less articles of clothing and all of that. So, that is a lot of how generations are defined and broken down is what are these shared cultural experiences that might shape how we behave. And again, there's kids born every year. So when we're looking at the strata, it's not quite as neat as, well, no kids were born for this 3-year gap, and that's the defining line. It's a fluid thing. So our gens are the ones that are in college right now. And they're going to be game changers. And I find it really exciting. But they're having us scratch our heads. So they're the kids that were born from like 1995 to 2009. Okay. So they're starting to come into the workforce. They're starting to take over the world a little bit. And there's just a lot of really cool things about them. They're the first kids born into a digital world. I didn't have text messaging in college. These kids can communicate in 17 different ways with people. Yep. They'd tell me like, oh, I didn't want to text message him because his iMessage is connected to his laptop, so I Snapchatted him instead. And I'm like, I just use text message, occasionally Instagram Messenger or whatever. Like that's all I got. They don't check their emails. I'm on my email all day long. You send them an email and it's like 3-day response and you're like, what's happening? But they were born basically, I guess they were toddlers when Facebook came out, but Facebook came out when I was in college. I remember it happening. It didn't exist when I got there. Yep. And so it's just this whole different world of communication and access to information. But it also makes them really, really bright. I lived in a bubble in college. I knew what was happening around me. They know what's happening all over the world. I even think of presidential elections here happening when I was in college. I had no idea what was going on. I quite frankly didn't care because I didn't have access to that information. I had to try really hard to seek it out. It's popping up all around them on every device they have. So they're just this really globally connected group. I had a Romanian pen pal in middle school, and I'd write a letter and I'd take it to the mailbox and it would find its way across the ocean, and then weeks or months later another one would come back. These kids are like, yeah, I texted someone from China the other day and we've been chatting. Like, what? Okay, cool. Or I WhatsApped them, right? So I think that they're just this really cool, diverse group. They're fast thinkers. They want to know. They want to create. And that becomes problematic in the sport world because the culture of sport is do what I say when I do it, or when I say it, and do it how I tell you to do it. I don't necessarily want to have to explain to you why, but they want to know why. They have the ability to know why anything. They can look up anything. How does this, I found this electronic in the trash. I'm going to Google it, and I'm going to take it apart, and I'm going to put it back together. They want to know why and how. And so I think it really makes some challenges for those of us, particularly in the sport world, working with them of how do we adjust our styles? How do coaches adjust their style? Because at the end of the day, all of us in sport, at the end of the day, we're all selfish, so we'll start with that. But at the end of the day, our job is to maximize the performance of our athletes. And if we are not accommodating and learning and making changes, we will fail at that. And so we can stick to our ways, we can be frustrated, we can grumble. But if we don't do anything different, we aren't going to capitalize on the talent that's in front of us. But that's really hard to do because we like to do things the way that we do them.
The two words I wrote down as you were speaking there, that as you mentioned at the end, have enormous repercussions for sports and sports coaching, communication and knowledge. And as you mentioned, a wealth of varied communication platforms, tools, etc. So how do we communicate with players? How do we get there's got to be a range of multimedia facilities to help us communicate with these people, this Generation Z, and also knowledge. There's so many platforms by which our players can go and acquire knowledge. And this is so pertinent for me because I was saying to you off air, I've just come back from a golf camp working with young players of a similar age, perhaps a touch bit younger. And these golf coaches are saying, these players are coming to us and talking about what they're working on and what they want to work on themselves because they've been watching this and this and this on YouTube. And occasionally those coaches are going, wow, this is awesome, this is brilliant. And occasionally these coaches are going, oh, wow, this this is so misguided, going in the wrong direction.
Yes.
So there seems to be this challenge now. So I'd like your comment on this in a second. I'll throw some things at you. This maybe more of a shift towards autonomy supportive, people or player led coaching, because our younger generation, this Generation Z, have the knowledge at their fingertips, if you like. I think that's very important, but also this dance that a coach has to have to be able to go, yes, this is great, keep doing that, but also having the communication capacity to go, well, hold on, can we look at this in a different way? That might not be the right path for you to go down.
Yeah. When I hear from coaches that they don't like that kind of athlete-led aspect, it's because what they want to say is, no, that's not right for you. Do it this way instead. Period. End of the sentence. Rather than, okay, yes, I can see why that's interesting to you, but here's what I know about you. And here's why I think this is the other direction. Again, coaches are not used to having to explain themselves, and they're not used to having to provide the information. And that's the disconnect. And so I think that there's a both and. I think that if coaches, so this generation also wants connectedness and loyalty and relationship. Now we're like, no, they don't. They just want to be on social media, but they do. They're seeking connection. And so if the coach gets to know the athlete, and the coach then is willing to say, yes, that is great, or no, that is going to mess you up, and then sit down and walk through, and here's why. Should they have to? Maybe, maybe not. That's not the argument that's relevant. Maybe you shouldn't have to explain yourself, but it will be immensely useful, and the small amount of time it takes to explain the why to an athlete is way smaller than the amount of time of frustrating experience when they're not doing and they're not listening and they're defiant and they're pushing back. If we don't explain why, it doesn't matter what type of way we're communicating with them. And so it's both creating content. So that's important. We got to buy in and create the content that they're going to. And then we have to be able to explain why, because we also can't just create content of, I put up this video of how to do it. I need to explain the why. It has to also be the content they're looking for. And, so our diving teams here are using a lot of this technology, and other sports as well, but I think diving's an easier one to kind of break down. So there are these cameras in the pool, and there's a delay, right? So you can go after your dive, you can watch that dive, you can get in-the-moment correction from your coaches, but now the technology is that the coach then can be on an iPad and poking at it, and all of your dives can be sent to your iPad with notes attached, so that you can go home, you can look at your dives, you can have notes. And so we're utilizing, rather than having to go to YouTube to watch something, I can actually go and watch myself, and I can look at what went wrong and what needs to go better, and I can scroll back and look at one that was really good, instead of saying, well, I'm telling you this, so it has to be true, and now because I'm a visual learner, because I'm a Gen Zer, because I like technology, because I'm on a device all the time, I'm not going to then have to go to YouTube or whatever platform they're on, TikTok, I think that's the newest one. I'm not going to have to go there because you're providing me the content I need. And so it's really about, what does this group need? What's going to help them thrive? And then we can do it. And again, yes, it takes time to learn that. And yes, it takes time to invest to do that. But it takes way less time than spinning our wheels and being frustrated and getting nowhere with them, which is what happens if we don't make these shifts.
And what I'm thinking there is, adaptability as a skill is so important. Yeah. And that's, in many ways, it's adaptability on the pitch or the court or the course, but it's adaptability with our people.
Yes. And that's great modeling, right? Do we not want adaptable athletes? I want you to be able to show up to whatever playing surface in whatever city, country, somewhere on the globe, and to adapt to the demands that we're placing on you. What great modeling it is to show that we are also adaptable. And if we are adaptable as old play, I'm 35 and I just had an athlete say, oh, they're like 30, which is like really old. And then went, oh, sorry. It's like not old. So if they see us old people adapting, it shows them that this is something worthwhile versus digging our heels in, standing our ground, and there's a time and place for that, absolutely. But if overall we're showing some general adaptability, how much more of that are we going to get from them? People do what they see, right?
Yeah. And kind of, I suppose being a typical psychologist here, challenging what we've just agreed on, that adaptability is important. How do you feel? There feels to me as I'm speaking and I'm reflecting on what we're talking about, there seems a tension between the capacity to be adaptable as a coach and having those the self skills, the self awareness of know your values, know your beliefs, know who you are, know your objectives. Not so much objectives, but values and beliefs. Do you find there to be a tension there between adaptable and know yourself, authentic and being adaptable?
Yeah, so I'm gonna venture into some sticky territory because I think the metaphor is really, really important, and I think it's really relevant. So I think in both your home country and my home country currently, there's a lot of political tensions, and what we know is that there are two primary sides in both of these spaces that feel really strongly that have these values and beliefs. And I think that most of us would argue that by and large, the fact that people have beliefs that are others is not the problem. It's the ability to communicate. It's the ability to listen, the ability to understand, and the ability to adapt and know who you're talking to and know how to talk. And I think that that's the crux of it, that yes, know your beliefs and feel strongly about them. And the adaptability piece does not mean budging on those. And it doesn't necessarily mean giving those up. It means listening. It means taking things into consideration. It means explaining them in a way that people want to listen. It means explaining them in a way that even if it doesn't change someone's mind, they can understand why and where we're coming from. When someone has different beliefs than me and they're able to explain why in a way that is calm and is thoughtful and is genuine, I'm able to say something like, wow, like I don't agree with you, but I understand why you think that. And even if I don't agree and if I wish that you thought something different, I get it. I get where you're coming from. And I think that that is something that, I mean, if you think about the fact that the political space that we're in and that's the world we're living in, that's really hard for us to do even in our jobs. Even as psychologists, that's hard sometimes. But I think as coaches, as I say these things to challenge coaches, right? Like I just was really bossy and was like, change the way you do things, be willing to give up the ways you've done things. It doesn't mean in a value base. If you value a certain style, there's a way to merge that and to hold that, but to communicate it in a way that's going to be received well, to communicate it in a way that's going to be heard. And we are not always going to persuade our athletes. I tell my athletes things all the time that do not persuade them. But I believe in them and I'm going to keep telling them, but I'm going to do it in a way that's not going to get the defenses up, that's not going to make them defiant, and that maybe it's just going to make them think about it. And so I think that that's the balance that, I want coaches to have coaching styles. I want them to have coaching strategies. I want them to have coaching philosophies. But I want them to also consider the environment that they're in, the people that they're talking to, and how do I effectively communicate that with folks. I think that to me is where that middle space is, because it can definitely sound like, hey, make all these changes and give up the things that are important to you or the values that you hold. But, there are things like little things like yelling. So there are coaches that yell and scream their faces off, and that's their style. And this is a generation that does super great with that. But what I tell coaches is that criticize the play, not the player. And there are coaches, like if you want to scream and yell and say, your running looked really lazy on that play and you need to get it together and you need to be quicker, and you're screaming that, I'm okay with that. If you are saying you are lazy and pathetic and you clearly aren't capable of doing this, that's where I have a problem. You can still yell and scream all you want, and if your philosophy is being hard on them and loud, but there's a way to do it that is going to be useful, and there's a way to do it that's going to be not so useful. And that, to me, is where those little shifts can occur to work best with this group of kids.
I love your answer in as much as when you were speaking there, I was actually thinking of the word empathy. and the importance of empathy. That listening statement I interviewed, we'll go back to Sports Psych Show number 68 with Professor Stephen Rolnick, the founder of motivational interviewing, and he talked about that importance of, look, you might not agree with the behavior of an individual, but you can empathize with that individual for executing that behavior because of their circumstance, or their personality, or how they go about things. I love that. And the other thing that came to mind there, which almost goes against some of the things I've said in the past, which is a good thing. Values and behaviours and the link between the two, and I think maybe historically I've been too ready to say, hey, values drive behaviours. Values drive behaviours, and I think probably by and large they do, but there can be a disconnect, and maybe sometimes it's important to be a disconnect. Maybe we can have our values, but also sometimes to be adaptable. As you're explaining, we have to go, well, these are my values, but I'm happy to behave in this manner and tolerate this behaviour because in this situation with this person, this is necessary for me to help them grow or help them manage themselves. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, I mean, and we're, we have cases like that all the time here in the college athletics world, that you have kids struggling with serious mental health stuff. And if my value as a coach is that my kids show up every day and they try as hard as they can, sometimes trying as hard as you can looks different if you're struggling with a serious mental illness. So my value can still be trying as hard as I can, but what that looks like is I might be allowing things that I might have never thought I would allow. I might allow a kid to skip a practice every now and again because for their mental health, well-being, and safety, it's important. That doesn't change my value. My value is still that they're trying their best, but I have to shift what best means. Maybe my value just needs to shift what that word means, and trying someone's best might mean that every month they end up being out one practice, and that is their best. That's the best they can give me. And so I think that, again, we see it all the time. And we're dealing with multiple scenarios in our department right now of having to say, yes, we can hold our values and allowing things to happen. Again, it's not giving up our values. It's just how are we enacting those, and how are we enacting those while considering the health, well-being, and performance of those around us. So, I think you're right on that, and I think our values do drive our behaviors, but are our behaviors actually reflective of our values? We've all done stuff that someone calls you out on, and you're like, no, that's not aligned with my values, right? Or how about when something crazy happens on a sports team, and they're like, our team's not about that. Well, you say your team's not about it, but this happened. And so that tells us that your team is a little bit about that. And so if your values, our values drive our behaviors, but sometimes our behaviors get away from us. And so if our values drive our behaviors, are our behaviors actually reflective of our values? I think it's a two-way street, right? So I don't think it's misguided to say our values drive them, but I think we have to have enough insight and self-reflection to make sure that those behaviors are reflecting our values accurately.
I do want to come to the mental health piece in a second, but there was just one more little discussion there that I'd like to focus on just for a couple of minutes, and that's how I wonder how adaptable a coach should be or needs to be or can be, especially around the performance piece, because you kind of referenced adaptability with mental health there, but I'm thinking about some of my experiences, and let's say a lot of my experience come from the English Premier League and soccer, and I'm thinking of players who had a wealth of skill in their feet, but if they were to do a NEO, a personality test, then they would come out very low conscientious, and so one could question their work ethic, their drive, if you like, because they're then low conscientious, and one can quibble about is there a hereditary thing there or whatever, and all that jazz.
Sure.
But does a coach, again, values, again, well, I've got a team here and a team ethic, but hey, I've got this this incredible athlete I need to play this incredible athlete, because ultimately if I don't, he might not score, or she might not score, and I get sacked. And so I'm going to be adaptable here, because this athlete has come to me and said, I don't want to train 4 times a week. I'm best when I train 3 times a week. Know it. And it's like, how adaptable do you be as a coach?
You know, I joke often anytime I talk to a group of coaches that you couldn't pay me enough to be a coach in this day and age. And I must say that we are a huge Tottenham household. And
I'm a Spurs supporter. I'm a Spurs supporter. There you go.
That's wonderful.
Awesome.
I am the worst person to watch sports with.
Okay.
So as my husband, who's in sports marketing and PR, when he is watching Tottenham and he's yelling at so-and-so and they're not trying, and I'm sitting here saying, well, but we don't really know. And he's like, oh, enough, right? Or, oh my gosh, you know, Deli doesn't even look like himself. And I'm like, but you don't have any idea what's going on in his life. And so, you know, it's one of those things where my hope is that coaches are making informed decisions. I tend to think that coaches overall have good intuition, and assuming they're building good relationships with their players, they're able to make those tough calls, and that probably what their gut is telling them is right. That they're going to be this, and it's not a carte blanche. This is not let the players run the team. There's a coach for a reason. They're hired for a reason, and athletes who want to play in these sports are participating knowing full well that they need coaching, right? That we need someone to be looking at the bigger picture, to be seeing things that we can't see and feel. And so, you know, the coaches are the expert in managing the team. And so I think it's being able to build those relationships one-on-one where if someone says, I think I need to only practice X days a week, we need to dig into that. And coaches need to feel empowered to understand that. Okay, why? What's going on? The physical load is too much. Okay, well, do we have some sports science that we can look at that? And maybe that's actually a thing for you. Maybe the mechanical load on the practice schedule that we have is too much for your physiology. Fine. I get really anxious and psychologically drained to where I don't even want to get up in the morning. Okay, maybe for a short period of time until we can get that under control, then okay, I'll make this accommodation, but only if you are willing to go and meet with the sports psych and do the work you need to do to build that resiliency. Or, you know what, you're right, you've had a stress reaction in your leg 4 times this season, and we've been able to pull it down each time. Well, maybe that's because X, Y, or Z. And so, you know, I think that that assuming coaches are using the resources that they have, assuming they're building relationships with their athletes, I think that coaches should be empowered to make those calls. I think the biggest fear I hear is, but what about the rest of the team? And it's going to affect the culture if I let that happen. And I talked with some student athletes the other day, a table of them. We had this conversation. And what I said is the culture of the team is not based on that coach's decision. It's based on all of the chit chat and gossip that the team does among themselves. When they say, oh, well, so-and-so only has to do this. Well, we need to make sure our athletes are trusting our coaches. That's an athlete problem. Trust that your coach is making a fully informed decision and that they know all the pieces that you may not, and that this is not, no one's out to get you. We all have the same goal. And so, you know, my hope is that coaches use their resources, feel empowered to make those difficult decisions, and then communicate that effectively. Because the flip side of that we've just spent some time talking about, coaches say, well, I'm allowing it, so deal with it, versus, hey, some information has come to light. This is what's going to be best for us as a team, as a whole. I need you to trust me on this. And this person is going to practice only 3 days for the next 3 weeks. And that's going to be better for us as a team because they're taking care of the things they need to take care of. But we usually just say, don't worry about it. So, you know, I think that is a hard decision. And again, I no way am I going to be a coach. But I really want our coaches to feel empowered in that way, that they are the experts on that. And if they can communicate the whys on that stuff too, they're not going to lose their players. We lose our players when we don't communicate and we make decisions they don't understand. And we look like it's favoritism rather than educated, informed decisions meant to help the team as a whole.
I wonder if the fear of reducing one's power as a coach and empowering our players, that's where coaches sort of put 1 and 1 together and come up with 4, in my opinion. They think that if they allow players, if they empower players to be vulnerable, to reflect back what they really think and feel, that they are reducing their power. However, I think actually they're increasing their power because they're lessening the threat response.
Yes.
That might be in between coach and the player.
For sure. I mean, time is a pie, right? If you need more time for something, it takes time from something else. I don't think power is a pie. I think that power, I don't think that giving someone more power means giving ourselves less power. I think that they are separate pies. I think that empowered athletes, I think they respond better. I mean, what I've seen, someone who's empowered is less fearful, less skeptical, more trusting. Now, do I have data to support that? I don't. That's my feeling. That comes from my gut. It comes from anecdotes, what I've seen, that when athletes feel empowered to communicate openly, to be vulnerable, to share honestly, when they feel empowered to do that, they're giving more power to that coach, because by hiding stuff, by not communicating, by grumbling internally, anything the coach tries is less effective. Therefore, giving the coach less power, because power is about being able to essentially control behavior in some way, not directly, but have an impact on the behavior of someone else. And I can have a greater impact on someone if I'm fully informed. When I don't have all the information, I have less power because I'm only making decisions or comments or whatever on what I know. And if I don't know everything, my perceived power is actually much less. That I think we gain more power by empowering other people.
I've been threatening to come back to the mental health piece, and I'd like to finish off there, if that
Sure.
is possible.
Yes.
You mentioned earlier that you'd recently done a presentation, and I'm sure some of that may be proprietary, so I appreciate that. But I think it's actually an area that I haven't touched upon too much on the Sports Psych show, and it would be really interesting to get your thoughts on. I think you mentioned the signs that coaches can look out for. With regard, your people, the people at your organisation, and signs of mental health distress.
Yeah.
I'd love to know, and I'm sure the audience would love to know what some of those might be.
Yeah. If there's one key takeaway, the overarching principle is a change in behavior. Now, there are a few key changes that are typically pretty indicative. So when we start to see a change in, and I think there's obvious ones. I think, if someone seems really sad for a long period of time, or if someone suddenly seems nervous all the time, those are some of the obvious ones. But less obvious ones are things like lower compliance with athletic training and medical recommendations. That's not usually because someone's a jerk. That's not usually because they don't care. It's usually because there's something going on, whether they're having a difficulty, mood issues related to injury and dealing with that, where they're having other mental health stuff separate from that something's going on. So we might see non-compliance. We typically see that as just someone being frustrating and defiant. In athletes, so I think in athletes, we have enough systems set in place where they can't just not do stuff. So in a non-athlete individual, depression might show up where they're not showing up to work, they're not showing up to social obligations, they're withdrawing. How sport at many levels works is that's not an option. If you're running late, someone's going to call you and find you and get you there. Or you don't have a choice. There's a punishment related to it. So you're going to show up, and a punishment greater than might be in my job, in a more traditional job, right? And so, we have to look for other things like, have I started being angrier? This person is suddenly, they were pretty chill. Maybe they, got angry appropriately, but now they go off at ridiculous things in practice that they never did. Rather than being like, you need to get it together, like you're a hothead, probably there's something else going on. It doesn't mean there's a mental health diagnosis, but maybe there's an inability to manage stress. Maybe there's other life stressors. This isn't saying that when these changes occur, someone's mentally ill, but it's a mental health concern. And so, again, like the bridge, if we can get ahead of that stuff when we're first noticing these changes, we can prevent potentially some of that stuff from growing into a more traditional mental illness or mental health crisis. But other types of changes. So someone who their confidence has declined all of a sudden, and maybe because they've made a bunch of errors, and at the highest levels, physical errors are rarely related to physical issues, right? You've done this activity tens or hundreds of thousands of times. It's something mental. And we usually assume it's just poor concentration or distractibility. But again, maybe there's a mental health concern going on that's causing this decline in performance or just decline in confidence. You were scoring a ton last season and now you're not confident. Intellectually, the data's there that I'm good, but I'm starting to feel worthless and less skilled. That's a great sign that it's mental health stuff. I think that we tend to try to write it off. I think we don't want it to be mental health stuff for people. We want people to be okay. Mm-hmm. But if we can acknowledge that there are some of these changes occurring and maybe there's something going on, and we've noticed this change, appetite, change in sleep patterns, change in socialization. So this person used to always suggest that they get lunch with their team, plan the pre-travel lunch before everyone gets on the bus or the plane or the train. And now they don't do that anymore. And now they again, kind of those types of changes are our biggest things. Now, again, a change for a day or two. We all have bad days. Nothing drives me crazier than the opposite, the too freaked out. They cried today. Okay. Well, was there something sad happening? Let's see if they cry tomorrow. And then the next day, how were they? Oh, they were fine back to themselves. Cool. We have bad days. I want people to have bad days. Occasionally, not all the time. So, it's change over time that's different from what we have known that person to be.
Essential things for coaches to look out for, and adds that not extra burden, but that extra responsibility on coaches. So
we don't train coaches in that. We throw them into the fire and say, good luck. And I used an example with our coaches yesterday. I said, I want you to treat mental health a little bit like TSA. So our airport security. See something, say something. Don't go open the box. Don't go try to do the counseling. Don't go try to down gritty. Don't ignore the box. Don't ignore that it's there. Notice it. And then say something. And say something to them. Say something like, are you okay? Is there anything I can do? Say something to whoever your professionals are. If you don't have a mental health professional that's accessible to you, you're almost always going to have an athletic trainer or a medical professional, and they probably know some type of resource. And so, I think that's the hardest part too, is we throw coaches into this place that we're now globally with mental health, and we give them no training. And then now I've said, here are things to look for. And they're like, cool, what do I do with that? I'm going to notice it and be like, neat, I noticed this. Now what? We have no training. And so, the empathy, the see something, say something, this idea that coaches, just because we're equipping them with this information, does not mean we're expecting them to fix it. We're expecting them to notice it and to move it up the chain to whoever can do that. In the same way, if I think our coach needs to know something because it's their area, I'm not ever gonna be like, hey, actually, when you kick the ball, I think you should turn your foot a little bit inward. That's not my area. So I think it's empowering them to do something. It's not asking them to do something they're not equipped to do.
Well, in terms of your area, I know you have a really vibrant Twitter account with some great stuff, and I know that our conversation will tap the interest of very, very many coaches. Would you be willing to share your Twitter handle? Do you have other social media where coaches can follow you?
Yeah, I'm not as active as I'd like to be, and being married to this sports marketing and PR guy, it drives him a little crazy. My Twitter is Sport Psych Mind. So Sport PSYCH Mind. I came up with it many, many moons ago. I wish it was something a little easier, but we're here now. I try to post some decent content. A lot of it is some random thoughts. A lot of it is just pictures of me at sporting events and the interesting things that I'm noticing. I have had a fantasy of doing some more writing. There's a website called Stick and Hack, and I'm doing some blogs for them. It's for golfers. Doing they call the doctor corner, I don't know, the psych corner or something. But doing some stuff on that. But Twitter is the best way. I am super accessible. If there are little one-off questions, tweet at me. I'll answer. make sure to tweet at me because I think I get an alert on my phone when that happens. I don't get on Twitter as much as I'd like. That's usually my 3 a.m. I have an 18-month-old, so it's my 3 a.m. pop on Twitter situation. But I'm happy to interact with anyone with any questions or thoughts or whatever.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Chelsea, that was awesome. I really enjoyed that conversation and I learned loads. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Brilliant. Well, look, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website to tell me exactly what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. Now, I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.